Well, 2019 was quite a year for my family. A lot of you know little bits and pieces of the story, but you may not have put together the whole thing. In January, our house caught on fire, and the 9 of us ended up living in a hotel for the next 10 months. In April, my car was totaled in an accident on a rainy Sunday morning as I was headed here to church. In May, Susan's parents had to be moved out of their home of 57 years and into assisted living. In July, they had to be moved to a memory care facility, and we had to sell all their belongings and their home in order to make them eligible for Medicaid. In September, Susan's father passed away. We finally moved back into our home 2 days before Thanksgiving, even though the house was not finished and the electricity would not be turned on for another 24 hours. According to professional counseling standards, we had hit 4 out of the 5 top stressors in life, and we did it in just 10 months. And so by Christmas, we were thinking, I'm so glad that's over. 2020 is going to be a great year. That's right, the pandemic was my fault. There's a lot of stories from the book of Daniel that are famous and involve great stressors. You know the story of Daniel in the lion's den, the stories of him interpreting the king's dreams, and that if he got it wrong, he would be killed, and the vision of seeing the handwriting on the wall. But today's reading of Daniel and his friends in the fire is right up there with some of the most stressful and the most miraculous. In short, Daniel and his friends were faithful followers of Yahweh while in exile. The king had recognized their leadership abilities and had given them positions of great influence in his government. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, had a huge bronze statue made, perhaps an image of himself or of one of the gods, but people were required to bow down before and offer prayers. And Daniel and his friends refused to do so, and their punishment was to be thrown into the furnace. As you heard in the scriptures, not only were Daniel and his 2 companions unhurt, but a 4th person was seen wandering around inside the fire with them. Nebuchadnezzar is amazed at this and orders them to be removed from the fire, but of course only 3 step out of the furnace. And at least for a short time, Nebuchadnezzar's heart is changed. Now, there are any number of lessons and stories that we can learn from this one, but I think the lesson that fits best is summed up by John Goldingay. He is the former principal at St. John's College in Nottingham, England. And he said this: "The 3 have not been delivered from the fire, but they are delivered in the fire. The life of blessing and success that is their destiny is reached not by way of costless and risk-free triumph, but by way of the cross. The divine aid who camps round those who honor God and extricates them from peril enters the fire himself to neutralize its capacity for harm by the presence of his superior energy. The experience of God's being with his people not only follows on their commitment to him rather than preceding it, it comes only in the furnace, not being preserved from it." And so what do these modern day fires look like? What does it mean for our faith today? Because no one in this country, nor in very many places in the world today, is being cast into an actual fire because of their belief in Jesus Christ. But the fire of stressful situations still comes in any number of ways to Christians today. Let me give you an example from each of the churches I have served over the last 30 years. When I was in Bertram, a little farming community. One of the farmers there was mauled by a cow. Now, I have to tell you, as a city kid born and raised, and this is my first experience in farmland, I thought, really? Mauled by a cow? Big fluffy thing that you get milk from? However, he was attempting to move a newborn calf to a new pasture, and Mama Cow thought he was a threat, and so she headbutted him into a tree over and over and over again until she relented. He ended up in the hospital with a broken leg, a dislocated knee, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a tree branch that went through his mouth, entering from underneath and coming out the opening. I next pastored in Goliad, where the 4-year-old son of one of our members of the church was playing out in the backyard, which was backed up by a large open field. After jumping off of the swings, he was bitten by a rattlesnake. His parents rushed him to the hospital as his calf began to swell. It swelled to the point where the doctors had to purposely cut open his leg to allow the swelling not to tear the skin or the muscle. Later examination found that the 2 fang marks from the snake were 1.5 inches apart. That was a big snake. When I pastored in Harlingen, an elderly couple from my church had gone to lunch with some friends when suddenly his wife collapsed. EMS was called, and they were rushed to the hospital where I met them. After less than an hour of treatment, doctors came to the waiting room to inform her husband that she was completely brain dead and there was no hope of restoring her life. They asked if he wanted them to continue or to disconnect her from life support. After much prayer and discussion, he decided to remove her from life support. We went into the emergency room long enough to anoint her and pray over her, and then we were dismissed back into the waiting room while the doctors began the process. And while in the waiting room, the husband looked at me and asked, "Do you think God will forgive me for killing my wife?" And most recently, when I was in Corpus, a woman who worked as a volunteer in the church office became visibly upset one day. During our discussion, she told me that 20 years earlier, her daughter, who was a child at that time, had been raped. The perpetrator was caught, tried, convicted, and sent to prison. And she had just received word from the prison that he had fulfilled his sentence and was set to be released later that week. She was beside herself with anger and pain that had been inside of her for 2 decades. And she was unable to reconcile her great hatred for what had happened and her faith that told her she needed to forgive him. You see, Daniel's fire comes in many forms today. But what we have to take from this is that God promises to be with us in the midst of the fire. Jesus does not say to us, "Let's see if you have enough faith to make it through this on your own, and then I'll come be with you." That is not the Jesus that we serve. And Jesus does not say to us, "I'll be waiting for you on the other side of this, and I'll receive you after it is finished." That is not the Jesus whom we serve. Jesus says, "I am here in the fire with you, and we will get through this together." See, Jesus was in fact there in the fire in that story from Daniel. And what makes this a post-resurrection story is the fact that he's been doing it ever since. In all the fires that we have to go through, it is Jesus who comes not to stand around the outside and hope that we can make it through. It is Jesus who comes in the middle of our fire, stands with us, and says, we will walk through this together. It was Jesus who walked with me and my family in the fire at 2019. It was Jesus who was there in the fire of this farmer in Bertram. It was Jesus who was there in the fire of the emergency room of this family with their small son in Goliad. It was Jesus who was there with the husband in the fire of that emergency room as he watched his wife pass away. And it was Jesus who was there in the volunteer office of my church with a mom who struggled with the fires of hatred and forgiveness. And so I have to ask you today, what fire are you going through right now? What circumstance in life right now feels like an overwhelming blaze in your life? Is it a family issue? Is it an issue with a job? Is it a health issue or a faith issue? Today, I'm going to ask all of us to pray for you. And I mean right now. I'm going to do something that we don't often do anymore. This was a practice of the church many years ago, but for today I'm going to revive it. I'm going to ask you in just a moment to bow your heads and close your eyes. And then I'm going to ask you, if you're going through a fire right now, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. No one else is going to see you except for Pastor Clay and myself. The AV team has already been instructed, you will not be on the screens. This will be as anonymous as we can possibly make it. But we're going to pray today. And we're going to pray not just for divine protection to keep this from getting worse. And we're not going to pray for just immediate rescue from the situation. Those are all appropriate prayers, and I have no problem with those. But today we're going to pray for you to be able to look around with the eyes of your faith and see that Jesus Christ is right there with you in the midst of this fire. You need to have that image in your head before we pray. And then trust that no matter what else happens, however your fire is resolved, you need to know that Jesus will never, ever leave your side. He will remain with you in the fire and through the fire until it comes to its end.